1920, exactly 100 years ago, almost to the day, because we just had our new year. Well, women just won their right to vote, talking films weren't even invented yet, and it took a many of days for news to get across the country. Recently, my mom and I got kind of curious about how things were 100 years ago, so we went down to our local library and we decided to look up a newspaper from 1920, January 3rd, from our local newspaper archives. And while we were reading through this newspaper, we realized that how people read news or read entertainment back in 1920 is very different from how it is today. Yeah, we have cell phones and other forms of media that we can consume, but a lot of the time newspaper is all people had, so there was a variety of things to read about, and also kind of a weird way to tell people things. Some of the stories featured in this local newspaper goes from murder in the local towns, or saying that an aunt came to visit from California at a local people's house. Which is kind of like a personal thing to be putting in the newspaper, but people wanted to know who was coming in and out of town and what was going on. So friends, family, come sit down, gather around, let us read the Times of State College, Pennsylvania, Wednesday 3rd, 1920. And I will feature some of the highlighted stories that I thought were the most interesting and the most odd. Now, the headliner of this newspaper of January 3rd, 1920 is a sad accident in Seven Mountains. A sad, unfortunate automobile accident happened to the family of Alfred P. Krepp of Center Hall while crossing the Seven Mountains from Potter's Mills to Milroy on Saturday at 10:30 o'clock, which resulted in the almost instantaneous death of his daughter Florence, aged 14. The paper goes on to say that they were on their way to Lewistown, being accompanied by Mr. Krepp's brother James and his two other daughters, including Florence and his older daughter that had a 3-year-old child in the car with them. It says that they were on their way to Lewistown to catch a train to go to Hershey, Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, Mr. Krepp had no chains on the machine to keep it from skidding, but being a careful driver, he descended the mountain without difficulty until he reached the bridge across Lauren Run Road, below the horseshoe curve in the public roads. He was driving slowly and carefully, but when the machine had almost crossed the bridge, it suddenly and violently dashed right, breaking the guardrail and landing upside down in the middle of the stream below. Now remember, there was no seatbelts in 1920, and if you took a look at the car earlier, didn't really have any windows either, so it was really easy to fall from this car. So let's continue reading. All the occupants of the car, except Florence, fell from the car and had no trouble in getting out of the stream. The one arm of the young lady was caught under the car. Her head was submerged, and it was first believed that she had drowned, but the undertaker, Mr. Goodhart of Center Hall, says that she had very little water in her lungs. According to the undertaker, he said that it's possible that Florence had died from the fall, and being underneath the car for so long is probably what killed her, because she was underneath that car for almost 15 minutes before anyone was able to pull her out. All the occupants of the car were more or less stunned from the icy water soon chilling them to the bone. The first to arrive to the scene was Mr. Schaefer of Milroy, who took the dead child in his Ford car to the undertaker. After taking the child to the undertaker, Mr. Schaefer took the rest of the occupants to the neighboring town in Milroy and got them some dry clothes. That following week at the Krepps' home, they had the funeral service for their child, and she was buried in the Center Hall Cemetery just a few miles away from their home. To follow up that sad story about a poor girl dying in an automobile accident, in a local town in Pennsylvania, police officers closed down streets so then kids could sled ride down the hills of the local town so then they don't get hit by cars. Isn't that nice? Fun sledding provided by police officers was in Sunbury, Pennsylvania. Let's take a look at some of the ads, shall we? There's one ad in here that I think is quite interesting, is that wanted, girl needed for general housework starting January 5th. Good wage, apply at Sigma Phi Sigma in State College, PA. Now, if you don't know what that is a frat house asking for a girl to come along and do some housework for them. And if you know anything about frats, you shouldn't be in there as a young lady doing housework, especially in 1920. Now, a fun note is that this ad ran for 4 consecutive papers, so no one applied for the job, so it's good to know that women were smart in 1920. So another ad that I thought was really funny was lost on December 2nd, a brown and white beagle. Poor dog, that's why she ran away. Award and no questions asked to W.G. Milford State College. So someone lost their dog, and now they're putting an ad in the paper being like, yo, my bitch ran away. I need her to come back home. Rewards, no question asked. In other news, now here's another interesting story. So remember, in 1920, alcohol was just legalized again, and so then people were running a lot of interesting ads about alcohol. But here's something that is awfully strange. Poison booze seized in New York City. Federal agents takes possession of enough liquor to kill over 20,000 persons. A conversation between a bartender and a dryman overheard by two individuals in an East Side saloon led to the seizing of 18 barrels of poisoned alcohol in Brooklyn. It says that the poisoned alcohol was consumed as whiskey, and really no one has any idea where it came from, and the investigation ended just a few days after it was found. There was no way to really track anyone in 1920, especially whenever they didn't do much forensics. Another interesting small article about alcohol was cider highballs have a high kick. In Hazleton, PA, drinks cost 50 cents each. Now, keep in mind, the average pay for people in 1920 was $2 a week, so 50 cents is like a third of your pay for that week. So what they're trying to advertise is that you only need this drink to get drunk. So then for 50 cents, that's an awful lot, and they're just trying to make up new ways to drink alcohol. Headache powder proves fatal. Philadelphia, Everett Halton, 48, of 15th Street, dies at hospital ODing on headache powder. He swallowed the powder at his home. Now, this next article I found to be interesting. It's basically the old lady brigade telling how young women should be wearing their clothes. Ills in clothing. Improper dress causes aches and pains, teachers say. So it's basically saying if you don't wear your corset right, if you don't wear one at all, you will die. So right now in 1920, fox scarves are really in style. So then there was plenty of farms that just raised silver foxes and then killed them whenever they reached maturity so they can sell them for scarves. So silver fox hides bring over $7,500 in Warren, PA. The Reiner Silver Black Fox Company, a fox breeder located in Warren, PA, sold their supplies of fur for $7,500 to C.M. Hampson, Co. of London, England. So they sold off their farm. So in today's money, that is over $100,000. So they kind of made out with that because silver foxes are obviously not in style anymore. So after the Fox article, there is a fashion in brief where they talk about what's in style for this season, what's good for young ladies, what's good for young children, and what's good for older, mature women, and just what's more in style, which varies from how short your skirt can be, if you can wear your hair up, what ribbons mean what, and just other cute things for women in that year. So personally, I find this next article probably the funniest out of all the articles here in this issue, where prized hog chokes on corn cob. Willington, Delaware, displayed at local hotel owner Levi F. Hollingway. So what happened is that this pig won the blue ribbon prize at the local fair, and they had it on display at this hotel. And while everyone was taking a look at this pig, it decides to choke on a corn cob and die. It came up to 1,205 pounds alive. I'm not sure how much it was dead. And as soon as it died, they're like, oh my goodness, we have to hurry up and butcher this pig weeks in advance that we were planning to. And they had to take it to the hotel kitchen where they weren't exactly equipped to butcher a pig. They went ahead and emergency butchered this pig after it choked on a corn cob. So you can imagine the emergency feeling and just the goofiness that was going on in that day. For this next article, robbers hang victim, New York City. But all right, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit because this is a kind of a complicated story to read from this old-timey talk newspaper. So what ended up happening was that 4 people walked into this grocery store, and this gentleman that was 28 years old ran the register. And they said, hey, can we have a can of tomatoes, these 4 men? And he's like, sure. And he goes up onto the shelf, and he goes to grab this can of tomatoes, where they knock him out, hang him from the ceiling by his neck and his feet, and they proceed to find the safe, stealing $428. They leave the grocery store with the money and leave him there unconscious and also kind of choking out, where a little girl comes into the store and sees him there, but he's still alive. She runs out of the store screaming, obviously, because there's this man hanging from the ceiling, and she finds help where he is taken down from the ceiling. He catches his breath, where he says, "I think it's a good time to go home," locks up shop, and proceeds on his way. So that's an interesting one for sure. They never caught the men that robbed the store, and he was okay to go on with his life the way it was. Now this is like a really interesting one. Doctor flies to victim on snowbound island, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. An unnamed doctor who flew to aid 3 children who lived with their family on Duffy's Island. Now, doing some research, we found out that Duffy's Island was changed. Its name was changed to 3 Mile Island. That was where the location of the nuclear meltdown was in Pennsylvania. So then we're talking about the island that had the nuclear shenanigans on it. But all right. The doctor was flown by Lieutenant Ray Brown. He would often crash his planes, it seemed, and he'd like be rebuilding the same plane and like going back up and then coming back down, crashing his plane. It was like the same plane, but just with plenty of different parts. By January of 1920, the family of John Pluffin Miller, also a World War I veteran, lived on Duffy's Island. Ice prevented the family from leaving the island, so a doctor had to fly in. The doctor arrived safely, but 1 child had already died and 2 were seriously ill with pneumonia. Alright, so here's some juicy drama from around that time period. Groom fails to turn up to wed Bucknell instructor. Miss Ruth M. Kenny was an instructor at Bucknell University in Lewisburg, PA. Recently resigned her position as a teacher of Spanish to prepare for her wedding to Dr. Vermel of New York City. The wedding was taking place on Christmas Day in a little church in Manson, Massachusetts. Wedding guests crowded the church, but the doctor failed to appear, and it is now learned that there is another Mrs. Vermel. So he already was married. Oh my gosh. And that she is present visiting in Harrisburg. So that's all that this newspaper said, but we did some further research, and it has like this story continuing in other newspapers. So it says that Mrs. Kenny went to the hospital to appear to the groom, was hospitalized due to an operation. So then the reason why he didn't show up was that he was in the hospital. Miss Kenny attempted to visit him, but he refused to see her or Miss Kenny's father. Miss Kennedy was diagnosed by a doctor with a fit of hysteria at the hospital, and was eventually hospitalized at the same hospital. She was released the following day. Mr. Vermel remained in the hospital for several days, refused to meet with his wife Flora, so his original OG wife. Flora did give an interview to the New York newspaper that explained that her husband was often due to the military requirements, but they had a good marriage. Otherwise, Dr. Vermont was still married to his wife in 1940. So this happened in 1920. In 1940, Mrs. Kennedy was married 4 times, and Dr. Vermel was still married to Flora, the woman that was like, yo, I'm the original wife, and I don't know why my man's trying to marry a younger woman. But yeah, that's kind of cool. A short article from Elizabethtown, PA is Boy Kills Playmate. There's 2 boys that were playing with their father's revolver, and eventually one of them gets shot in the temple and is killed instantly. That is an interesting one for sure. Nobody was charged because they were both under the age of 8. Woman enters presidential race, 1920. Abby Whistler of Chicago, first woman to place herself in the presidential race for the Republican Party. The article goes on and kind of doesn't really talk much about her. They just kind of say, yeah, she's a chick running for president. That's cool. This is only a year that that women was granted the right to vote. So as soon as she was granted the right to vote, she decided to run for president. But she isn't really given much credit, and all we're given really is that her name is Abby Whistler of Chicago. But yeah. All right. Now this is the one that my mom and I decided to save to the very last because we did a lot of research on this story. The headline reads, Woman Slays Man in Her Room. This news is featured to be first ran on Friday, January 2nd of 1920, and it continues for weeks and weeks and weeks because this is a ongoing trial, and we wanted to get the full story for you guys. For the sake of understanding this story completely, my mother has taken liberty to rewriting this article to be easier for me to read and also for the story to be easier to understand because we had to do some digging to get all the facts. So, without further ado, woman stabs man in her room in Maryland. So, all right. Due to how news travels, it is hard to determine if the crime takes place on December 31st or January 1st. The news reports that all begins that Mrs. Kate Yule, age 25, of Cumberland, Maryland, stabbing Edgar Bryan Pownell, age 23. Because he would not confess to Mrs. Yule's husband, Merlin Yule, age 26, that she was not being unfaithful to her husband. This story details begins with Pownell, who, along with his father, was temporarily residing with his uncle, upstairs neighbors to the Yule family. The evening before Pownell's death, Pownell arrives at the Yule's home to tell Mr. Yule that his family received a telephone call from Mr. Yule. The caller requested that Yule hurry to the dance of the Redman's Fair in Miller Hall, which is in town, like away from the house. Mr. Yule immediately left his wife and 3 children to go to the dance. Once that Mr. Yule left, Pownell enters the Yule residence, locking the door, and begins to force his attention on young Mrs. Yule. After several hours, Mr. Yule returns home and finds the door locked. Mrs. Yule unlocks the door and Pownell rushes past Mr. Yule and up the stairs to his uncle's apartment. Upon seeing Pownell, Mr. Yule begins to argue with his wife. The argument continues into the next day, even though Mrs. Yule tells her husband it has been several weeks that Powell has showed her unwanted attention and had forced his way into their home. Mr. Yule orders her to leave their home by noon. So Mr. Yule is basically telling Mrs. Yule, yo, get out, you're being unfaithful, I don't care what you say. Powell is obviously like your new lover and I don't care. So he doesn't believe his wife of the story. Out of desperation, the next day, Mrs. Yule summons Powell to her home. She then begs Powell to tell her husband that she has not been unfaithful to him. Powell refuses, and out of frustration, Mrs. Yule stabs him in the left breast. Powell then stumbles back up to his uncle's apartment, and after a half hour later dies. After admitting to the stabbing of Powell, Mrs. Yule is taken to jail and held without bond. Her youngest child is still breastfeeding and must remain with her in prison. Reporters continue to pry into the lives of the Powell and Yule family. The Powell family shares their side of the story. Powell told his family that Yule was taking a young woman home, and that was why Powell was coming up to the stairs as Yule arrived home. Powell's family could hear the argument between Mr. and Mrs. Yule, and Yule was accusing his wife of entertaining Powell. The Powell family states that they often heard the Yules argue. They credit Mrs. Yule for being a good wife, mother, and housekeeper. Mr. Yule often stays out all night, and a few days before the stabbing had put his wife out of the house and locked the door because she refused to put his socks on him. So then this husband isn't a very good husband. He is staying out all night, she's doing everything that she needs to be doing, but then once she refuses to even put his socks on one day for him, he's like, yo, I'm having a fit. So, let's continue. On the morning of the stabbing, Mrs. Yule visits the Powell apartment to coax the young Powell to visit with her in her residence. Despite his father and aunt's warning, accepts the invitation. 2 minutes later, young Powell returns to tell his family that he has been stabbed. Powell's aunt shares that Mrs. Yule had told her that the young Powell was the dearest boy on the face of the earth, but her love for him did her no good because she was married. By January 9th, the headline shifted to Mrs. Yule to be tried January 19th for stabbing a lover to death in kitchen. On January 9th, the grand jury issued an indictment for killing of Powell. January 17th, during the arraignment in Cumberland, Maryland, Mrs. Yule says she is not guilty. She then returns to prison with her 1-year-old baby and was accompanied by her husband. The trial will start the following week. Friends of Powell now share that Mrs. Yule stabbed him following his refusal to elope with her. So then Powell was like, yo, come with me, girl. And she just was like, nah, I got a family and kids. On the eve of Mrs. Yule's trial, a new headline hits the paper. Mr. Yule arrested on eve of his wife's trial. Marvin Yule was found in a room at a small hotel with Mrs. Bessie Mitchell. He was charged with disorderly conduct. The article reported that Yule was able to post his $15 bond, but skipped the hearing before the city magistrate. Mrs. Mitchell, in the meantime, is in jail and unable to procure bond. Yule also has not worked since the tragedy and is living apart from his wife, who will soon be in prison. For those who don't know, people who ran hotels had the right to ask for your marriage license whenever renting a hotel. You can see in like a lot of old-fashioned like movies that would be like, oh, we're not married, we can't have a hotel together, and then like so that's why you kind of had like a warrant to like go into a hotel room and be like, hey, you're cheating on your wife, you're going downtown. So that's why it was so easy to be like, yo, you're going to jail because you're cheating on your wife with this Mrs. Mitchell. So all right. February 5th, newspapers highlight that with her 16-month-old daughter nestling in her arms, Mrs. Yule is placed on trial for her life today in the Allegheny Central Court. The pretty young mother of 3 is charged with slaying Edgar Brian Powell, 23, former United States Air Serviceman. Powell was stabbed to death with a carving knife in the kitchen. Mrs. Yule's defense is to be unwritten law. She claims that Powell was stabbed to death after he had attempted to attack her. During jury selection, a box of candy was sent to Mrs. Yule by the National Women's Suffrage Association of Allegheny County. The suffrage organized issued a statement, "We feel sorry for Mrs. Yule and support her." So this organization, the National Women's Suffrage Association, is the same people who fought for the rights for women to vote. As her children played in the courtroom, Mrs. Yule's trial continued for several days. The parents of Powell hired additional attorneys to help the state's attorneys. Despite all the laws against her, a jury of men acquitted Mrs. Yule for the slaying of Powell. Following the trial, Mrs. Yule attempted how afraid she was for her husband and all the men involved in the arrest and prosecution. When asked why she did not insist that she and her husband confronted Powell in his family's home, Mrs. Yule said that she was terrified that her husband would kill her. She also shared that Powell was kind and would stop to fix her children's toys and play with them. She had trusted him and he forced his attention on her. Following the trial, Mr. Yule had vanished and was reportedly living in Philadelphia. Mrs. Yule and children returned to her childhood home to live with her parents. However, according to the 1930 census, Marvin and Kate spent 5 years apart and then reunited. So Mr. and Mrs. Yule eventually started living together again. They went on to have 4 more children, and Kate passed away in 1976. So there is the story of the man who slayed her lover in her bedroom, but really it was more of him taking advantage of her and being in a bad marriage situation. Well, that is the end of the January 3rd, 1920s edition of the newspaper. Maybe I'll continue doing something like this more often. I really enjoyed making this video and doing the research. I'm really into history. I know it's a little different from what I usually do, but then, hey, like this video if you did. Don't if you didn't subscribe to me, you'll get more of me. But all right, everybody, have a good day. Bye-bye.